I also visited my mother in New York City among my other travels. I like to joke that I grew up on a train. And while she was overseas in London, I lived for a while with my father, they were divorced, and my stepmother in Salina, Kansas and Hastings, Nebraska. Kansas and Nebraska, to my way of thinking, come under one heading. It's called flat. No mountains. I really like mountains. But something wonderful did happen to me in Salina, Kansas. I was there on VE Day when the war in Europe ended. And a few days after the surrender and the celebration, I saw a newsreel about VE Day that had been filmed in London. And I actually saw my mother in the newsreel. That's one of the things that I remember most, was seeing her waving from the window of the American Embassy, throwing confetti, and it was the first sight I'd had of her in, by then, more than a year, but it would be another year before I actually saw her again. The real adventure began for me when I went to Berlin in 1946. Grandma Tulsi and I went to New York City to Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, and from there we were put aboard the USS Goethals, a converted Liberty ship on diaper run, and sent to Germany with the first group into Germany of American independence after World War II. At Bremerhaven, the train pulled right up to the dock by our ship, and we were taken from the ship to the train and went by train into Berlin and arrived after dark that night. There's a wonderful picture, the picture I've used on the cover of the book, Marion's Child, that was taken when my mother and I saw each other again for the first time after more than 2 years in Berlin. I lived in Berlin for the better part of 7 years. The first 2 years were all about ruins, hungry people, privation, even danger. And I was afraid of the Germans. We had been taught to be afraid of them. But I didn't have to stay there long to find out that most of the Germans were pretty much just people like us who were in a really bad situation and needed our compassion and our help. Over these many years since then, I've talked to Berlin, maybe not all that often, but I've talked to my family about those years and days in Berlin. And the funny thing about it is, when I begin to speak, I never know which memories are going to surface for me. They're all in there somewhere in my memory, in a data bank like a computer, but I don't know necessarily the call-up codes. I begin to speak and things may come up that I haven't even thought about since they happened in 1946 or 1947 or 48. Those were dramatic years. They were wonderful because I lived with my mother, and she was, of all the people I lived with, my favorite. And they were terrible years because I saw things that an American child does not ordinarily find herself exposed to. And you have to decide, do I pretend not to see it? Do I admit I see it? Do I remember it up front in my mind? Or do I push it back to some corner of my memory and say, well, you know, I'll deal with that later. I think most of us push it back to a corner of the mind and memory and say, I'll deal with that later. Berlin was like nowhere else in the world in those days. The destruction stretched for miles and miles. You could go for miles in the city without seeing a single building left standing. I visited the sites that were so famous, the Nazi sites, so famous to the Third Reich and the war that had just ended. I was actually in the bunker, Hitler's bunker, where he and Eva Braun died. By the pit where their bodies were burned, there were still some jerry cans, gasoline cans that had held the gasoline used to burn the bodies. And I was very tired at one point, and I sat down on one of those jerry cans. that had held the gas that burned the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun. And that was just the beginning. We had some really adventurous sightseeing, and now that I'm going through those old pictures pretty much for the first time, I think, wow. I am amazed that we did have so many pictures, that we took so many, that we kept so many, that we bought some, and I am delighted that I can share them now with my readers of Marion and Marion's Child and the books yet to come, and with people who are interested in history, and particularly the history of immediate post-war Berlin. I'd been living in Berlin for a little less than a year when I just sort of woke up one day and I realized this is home. It feels like home, and I've never lost that feeling. Berlin has been my home since then. In 1948, trouble was brewing with the Russians, and my mother sent me and Grandma Tulsi back to America, while she did some other things along the way. We were in what was either the last or the next to the last car out by highway, by Autobahn, before the Russians closed the borders for the blockade. And my mother drove the car back in as one of the last cars to re-enter Berlin before the borders were closed. I stayed with Grandma Tulsi in Florida, but mostly I stayed with my father in Tennessee in 1948 and 49. And then I went back to Berlin when Mother got another job there in 1949. And my first plane ride was into Berlin during the blockade on the Airlift. That's a whole story in itself, and I hope you'll find the time to read it in my book, Marion's Child. When my mother and I went back to America for what's called home leave, that is 3 months vacation back in the United States, in 1950 for Christmas, returning to Berlin in early 1951, we stayed over for a few days in New York City, went to some Broadway shows, Kiss Me Kate, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and then after having spent time in Florida and in Tennessee, we went back to Berlin again. By then, I was a young lady, at least I looked like a young lady, having matured early, and I was dating, and I often went to the cultural events with my friends. My mother was a beautiful woman, and she was also dating, and sometimes I liked her dates, sometimes I didn't. But you know, we just make do about things like that. A lot of the time, she and I socially went our separate ways. And one of the things that I greatly enjoyed, apart from the cultural experiences, was the baseball league. I got interested in baseball then. There was a division level league provided for Americans by the military government, and I went to baseball games all summer long. I absolutely loved it. I sang in the church choir at the Army Chapel at McNair Barracks, and I also continued to explore Berlin beyond the American enclave community. It is a fabulously beautiful city. It was at one time the most populous city in the world, and when I was there, it was still the biggest city in the world in area. I continued to explore Berlin outside the American enclave, but to be truthful, things were different now. We never saw our Russian friends anymore. We never went into the Russian sector, at least not very often, and certainly we did not venture into the Soviet zone of Germany, as we had done when we went to the Leipzig Fair. The only time in my later years in Berlin that we went into the Soviet zone was when we had orders to visit Potsdam, which is pretty much a suburb of Berlin, right across the Havel River, to go to the Sanssouci